Good evening, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to react to Slavs and Tatars. I gave my reflections the title, The Politics of Time, Crimea as a meeting place of the past, the present, and the future. Time is an underappreciated factor in political analysis. The politics of time denotes more than just the start and end point of an event, a process, or a cycle. Instead, it revolves around contested claims about legacies from the past, political agendas of the present, and visions for the future. The present engages simultaneously with the past and looks to the future. The present rewrites history through a selective process of remembering and forgetting, and thereby seeks to legitimate current and future state and nation-building processes. Different aspects of temporality structure our understanding of the world around us. We're aware of notions of timing, of duration, acceleration, tempo, and we differentiate between rapid versus gradual and short-term versus long-term change. My own discipline, political science, speaks of path dependency, a concept that posits that the order of events matters and becomes more important over time. It struggles to disentangle the causal role of legacies. It tries to understand the consequences of a certain sequencing of policies. It pays attention to critical junctures which disrupt and reconfigure familiar patterns. And it specializes in generalizations based on data collected at regular intervals. There are many parallels in our everyday use of temporal reference points. Time primarily appears as a tool to contextualize, to compare, and to emphasize, rather than as the central subject of inquiry. How do different conceptions of time exist in parallel, overlap, clash, or shift? What are the mechanisms through which the past inscribes itself into the present? My discussion of these issues starts from a space and a theme that figure prominently in the lecture by Slavs and Tatars. The space is the peninsula of Crimea, and the theme is the relationship between the self and the other, with their inherent attempts at classification. The paradox is that while the self and the other are employed as frames that create and reinforce difference and thereby help self-identification, the categories themselves are in flux, and the other, at one point in time, can be an essential part of the definition of the self at a later stage. Crimea is an interesting example of the construction of identities based on a wide range of parallel, overlapping, and contested memories and images inspired by its location, landscape, and population, and transmitted through maps, toponymy, travelogues, legends, literature, and art. The time frame here clearly reaches further back than the 100 years now. The boundaries of Crimea as a cultural space are difficult to draw. History has continuously been rewritten, and Russian and Soviet histories have been dominant, but they have been challenged by the Crimean Tatars and the Ukrainian state, among others. When the Russian Empire expanded southwards in the 18th century, Crimea, with its Tatar and Ottoman legacy, was perceived as something different, even exotic. But by the late 19th century, it had already been appropriated as an integral part of the self. In the Soviet period, Crimea was redefined as an important component part of the Soviet self. And in the post-Soviet period, since 1991, it has occupied an ambivalent position between a new other, independent Ukraine, and the self in Russian national identity. In 2014, a moment of political upheaval in Ukraine tipped this ambivalence into a strong revival of the idea of Crimea as a defining element of Russia's self. At the time of the annexation of Crimea by Russia in March 2014, Crimea was not an other, but very much a self located within an other, Ukraine. And that other was threatening to increase its cultural and political distance from Russia in the aftermath of mass protests and the ouster of then-President Viktor Yanukovych. There are certain moments when temporality is compressed and the past, present, and future appear more closely intertwined than in ordinary times. Often these moments are moments of domestic and international crisis, or both. The occupation and annexation of Crimea by Russia in 2014 constitutes one such moment characterized by the close proximity of past, present, and future. Moments like these disrupt the logic of the present. Phenomena that were prematurely relegated to the past can resurface, among them manifestations of the power of nationalism or the fragility of international legal norms. The moment then becomes a window onto different temporal layers of political claims and identities. For our analysis, it usefully widens the time horizon, but it also comes with the risk of reaching for yet another linear narrative that promises to reduce complexity in the heat of that moment. Just as definitions of the self and the other evolve over time, there is no universal perception of time itself. Time is inherently political. Which historical events are deemed significant for what historical narrative is a choice made through filtering and selecting. This process comes with its inbuilt objectives and biases. In these temporal hierarchies, historical events are shortcuts and lenses onto larger processes, for example, the construction of national state identities. In the case of Crimea, at least three national temporal perspectives overlap and clash. Russians prioritized the imperial conquest of the peninsula in 1783, the battles over Sevastopol in the Crimean War and the Second World War, the unrightful transfer of Crimea to the Ukrainian SSR in 1954, and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 that turned the peninsula into a region in a neighboring state. The Crimean Tatars view their national homeland Crimea primarily through one dramatic event, their deportation by Stalin in 1944 and their return since the late 1980s. The Ukrainian state perspective centers on 1954 as a pragmatic and legitimate border change, which Kiev has invested in since, and on 91 as the belated recognition of an independent Ukrainian state. Each narrative highlights different elements of Crimea's history. The Russian nationalist narrative projects the continuity of a Russian Crimea from the age of Catherine the Great to the present, while ignoring Crimea's preceding centuries as an independent Crimean Tatar Khanate and as a part of the Ottoman Empire. The deportation of the Crimean Tatars under Stalin also remains outside mainstream Russian imagination of Crimea. And the transfer of Crimea to the jurisdiction of the Ukrainian SSR under Khrushchev in 1954 is not accepted as a legal basis for Crimea's post-Soviet belonging to an independent Ukraine. Crimea is a setting of repeated large-scale national defeat, has been reappropriated into a Russian narrative about national glory and resistance, symbolized by the two sieges of the city of Sevastopol during the Crimean War and the Second World War. Today, Crimea is everything but the other in the Russian mindset. This streamlined identity project, pursued even more vigorously by Russian elites in Moscow than in Crimea, blanks out Crimea's lived reality, including the complexity of the past inscribed into the ethnic makeup of the regional population, the peninsula's toponomical landscape, and its place in literary and popular imagination. The myth of Crimea in the Russian imagination began as an elitist imperial exotica with this journey of Empress Catherine II in March 1787 through the newly conquered southern provinces of the Russian Empire. Catherine II and her companions, Joseph II of Austria, alongside French, English, and German counts and envoys, were spared any evidence of disorder and unrest thanks to Grigory Potyomkin's adept stage managing of the tour. They encountered seemingly happy, well-fed peasants en route, the so-called Potyomkin villages, and in Crimea they met peaceful Tatars who swore allegiance to the Russian state. Contemporaries interpreted the tour as a demonstration of the grandeur of Russian imperial power, but it was also the beginning of the Russian romance with the peninsula, its jewel in the crown. In the 19th century, this tradition was continued with the Crimean Riviera being the luxurious playground of the Russian and European literati and wealthy elites. In Soviet ideology and popular imagination, the peninsula was proletarianized as a zone of working-class tourism, symbolized by the Crimean pioneer camps and sanatoria where the Soviet Union holidayed and Soviet elites retired. The collapse of the Soviet Union tore apart the cultural and historical map created by Russian imperialism and Soviet ideology. Crimea now found itself outside the Russian Federation, a shock of dislocation which reverberated widely across Russian political elites and society at large. Interestingly, many of Crimea's natural features retained their Crimean Tatar names even during the Tsarist and Soviet periods. Parallel Russian or Hellenistic names creating continuity with Byzantine Greek influences, for example, the best known two cities, Simferopol and Sevastopol, and translations of Crimean Tatar names were introduced, but in public and literary imaginations, they never fully replaced the Tatar names. Inside Crimea, there is, to borrow an evocative term coined by the Nigerian writer Chimamanda Adichie, no single story of Crimea. Not all the memories and identities attached to Crimea are mutually exclusive and conflict-prone. They are shaped by a general recognition of Crimea's multi-ethnicity and a collective identification of all main ethnic groups with Crimea's landscape, location, and natural beauty. A shared imagining of the region provides ample raw material for rival claims during political mobilization in times of uncertainty, but it can also underpin the attempts to accommodate diversity. Surveys of the Crimean population and its political elites have repeatedly demonstrated the relevance of the self-identification as Crimean, Krimchanin, within and across ethnic groups, and multi-ethnicity is the most frequently highlighted characteristic of the region. According to the 2001 census in Ukraine, just under 60% of the regional population were Russian, just under 25% Ukrainian, and about 12% Crimean Tatar. The figures have changed since the annexation by Russia last year. As Benedict Anderson has described in his book Imagined Communities, the census, alongside the map and the museum, is a very powerful tool of control and identity construction. In the case of Crimea, data on the ethnic breakdown of the region suggests clear categories where in fact the ethnic background of ethnic Russians or ethnic Ukrainians is often mixed. The same holds for the eastern regions of Ukraine embroiled in war at the moment, where already 7,000 to 8,000 people have died and about 2.5 million people have been displaced. Ukraine tends to be portrayed as a country split into east and west along ethno-linguistic lines, and the war has reinforced this misconception of the Ukrainian state. Similarly, the annexation of Crimea has inadvertently led to a widespread tacit recognition of Russia's historical claim to the region. Here, the dangers of accepting a new or not so new single story in the midst of a crisis become apparent. A prominent example of a shared regional storytelling shall suffice to illustrate the notion of Crimea as a multi-ethnic cultural space. Among the most widely known and most often told legends are those connected with distinctive rock formations along the southern shore of Crimea. In particular, the legends about the Ayudag, the bear mountain near Gurzuf. Tatar legend tells us that the bear was sent by Allah to punish and destroy the unruly inhabitants of the shores. When he took too long to finish the task, Allah turned him into stone as he knelt down to drink some water. And a more romantic version describes a stranded girl reared and treasured by the bears inhabiting the island. When she falls in love with a young man washed ashore and decides to flee, the bear starts drinking the seawater in order to pull their boat back to land. The beautiful voice of the singing girl makes them stop, and one bear is turned into stone, depending on the version of the story, either by the sound of the girl's voice as a result of Allah's punishment, or because he remains in the same position watching his beloved girl disappear. And even a dominant cultural and temporal perspective can have unintended consequences. The Russian writer and poet Sergei Pushkin spent only a few weeks in Crimea on his way to the Caucasus. But the work inspired by his stay has become a powerful reference point in Russian and European literary imagination. In his poetic cycle, Tavrida, he refers to the happiest minutes of his life in Crimea. He evokes the image of a distant and magical region. For Pushkin, there is no doubt about Crimea being Russian land. The Crimean Tatars, their lives and gardens, form a picturesque background. It is precisely this romanticized, seemingly apolitical image that has come to dominate the Russian view of Crimea. One of Pushkin's best-known poems commemorates the legendary fountain in the Khan's palace in Bakhchisarai, Bakhchisaraysky Fontan. The Khan's palace appears to have survived Stalinist destruction because Stalin liked the poem, and perhaps indirectly because of its central role for Russian nationalism. The poem tells the story of the Khan Girai and his love for a Polish Christian woman he brought to his palace. When one of his jealous wives kills her, he erects an ever-weeping fountain of white stone decorated with roses. This became a Russian and Polish literary topos and tourist destination that blends a supposedly Turkic image of romance and violence into the tamed other. These literary references became building blocks of Russian imperial identity, but they also preserved references to Crimean Tatar legacies in Russian, Soviet, and Western imagination. Crimea as a multi-ethnic region combines an inherent potential for conflict with scope for conflict prevention. This apparent contradiction is illustrated by the difference between the political events in Crimea in the 1990s and 2014. From the fall of the USSR in 1991 to 2014, Crimea was seen as a rare example of non-conflict among the cluster of post-Soviet territorial conflicts. The potential for conflict in Crimea in the 1990s revolved around its unclear status within the newly independent Ukrainian state, its post-Soviet relations with the former imperial center Moscow, in particular the uncertainty over the fleet bases in Sevastopol, and the tension between the cultural and political domination of the ethnic Russian and Russian-speaking majority of the region and the Crimean Tatars returning from their places of deportation. Even in Western perception and media discourse, the likelihood of a violent conflict in the 1990s loomed large. Elsewhere, I have emphasized the process of institution making a lengthy process of elite bargaining over autonomy, rather than the actual autonomy status resulting from this process as a critical factor in conflict prevention in the 1990s. Russia's initial policy under President Yeltsin was to deter Russian nationalism in Crimea in favor of good bilateral relations with a Ukrainian state whose foreign policy zigzagged between Russia and the West. By late 2013, Russian policy under President Putin was reconfigured to mobilize this same nationalism, leading to the annexation of Crimea. The main difference was that by 2013, Putin had abandoned his predecessor's pretensions of integration with Western states around a rule-oriented international order. The domestic political conditions in Ukraine, the Maidan protests, and the resulting regime change and pro-Western tilt of the new Ukrainian government were the trigger for Putin to instrumentalize the power of nationalism. Let me draw this to a conclusion. Focusing on one particular space, Crimea, and one extreme moment, the annexation by Russia in 2014, allows us to think different temporal perspectives at once, and thereby question static classifications of self and other, and the linearity of national imaginings of culture, history, and politics. For at least a moment, the politics of time crystallizes into something tangible, but the risk of imposing a similarly misleading linear narrative onto this moment is also high. Thank you.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming. I also like to thank HKV for inviting me to this wonderful event, and it's a really wonderful place to come to, full of intellectual generosity and professionalism, so it's wonderful to be here, thank you. I've been asked to comment on the Slavs and Tatar lecture and some of the images, and link them up to some of the sort of overarching topics of this event, namely time, temporality, and not least the now. And I'll try to do that. It will take the form of a 20-minute lecture that I hope will kick us off to a great discussion afterwards, which is sort of the goal of the whole thing, I think. Anyway, here we go. In Greek mythology, there's a recurring image of a young man who has no hair at the back of his head, but a long lock at the front. To catch him, you have to seize hold of his hair, but when he's past you, it's already too late. You end up grasping at his bald, shaven head. His name is Kairos, and he's the moment to be seized, the right moment for action, for intervention, for speaking up, for seizing an opportunity. If it makes sense to talk about the temporal dimension, which has not received the attention it deserves, and it probably doesn't make sense, but you have to bear with me on this, I would like to suggest that the most underrated temporal dimension in our current temporal economy or ecology is the now. First, this might seem like an absurd claim. One of the most often cited signatures of our time is the so-called tyranny of the moment, which forces us to stack ever more tasks, appointments, and activities into an ever smaller time span, often referred to as the time squeeze or the time crunch. Additionally, more and more pressure is put on the now due to the developments in media and communications technology, producing breaking news, liveness, simultaneity, synchronizing the lives of billions of people every second. Both historians and social scientists seem to agree that global civilization is haunted by a kind of presentism, in which both the past and the future are spaces of experience as well as our horizons for expectation, to use Reinhard Koselleck's terms, are eclipsed by an ever-expanding present, an inflated now. But is this really all there is to say about the now, which is undeniably at the same time the indispensable temporal framework for all our experiences, decisions, and actions? How can we make decisions about the future? How can we draw lessons from the past? How can we experience and even bring about historical change except under the temporal condition of the now? And not least, why should we accept the media and technologic that tries to impose on us the idea that the now is almost completely devoid of extension and can be reduced to a kind of media-induced liveness, which lasts only as long as a specific kind of communication can keep our attention, mostly a matter of seconds, in best case, minutes. This project at Haus der Kulturen der Welt, and more particularly this event, is, at least as I see it, an attempt to explore the extensions of the now, but horizontally and vertically, as it were, both in time and space. The lecture just witnessed by Slavs and Tartars imagines the possibility of a very different now from the one I just described, both longer, broader, and thicker, if you like, and thus infinitely richer both in experiences from the past and in possibilities for the future. However, we are not the first to have had similar worries. Not the first to have seen the now shrink and dissolve, become ungraspable and always non-existent. Under completely different media, historical, and technological conditions, in the famous 11th book of his Confessions, St. Augustine, then Bishop of Hippo in North Africa, discusses the three dimensions of time: past, present, and future. That is, he has sincere doubts if the temporal dimension that we call the present and now can really exist. How long does the present last, Augustine asks. 100 years, he suggests, thus anticipating the organizers of this event by almost 2 centuries. But no, 100 years seems too long, he concludes, and he goes on to experiment with other durations, other time spans, a year, a day, finally an hour. In this way, in Augustine's philosophical imagination, the present shrinks into what we might call a moment, or in German, ein Augenblick, the blink of an eye. A movement anticipating in a strange way what we today often refer to as acceleration, or more precisely social acceleration, in the words of the sociologist Hartmut Rosa, or simply in ordinary language, that time goes faster. Of course it doesn't really, but that in this case seems less important. So in Augustine's Confessions, the now all but disappears. What remains is nothing but a line or a border separating the past from the future, or put differently, a point of passage, where the time moves from the past into the future, but which in itself has no extension, neither in time nor in space. Among our most important, I would claim, theoretical and critical tasks today is to reconfigure, reframe the now, our now, not as a line or a border, but as what the German philosopher Edmund Husserl famously called an extensional field, ein Zeitfeld, in which past and future are ever present, either as memories, archives, written and material remnants, or as hopes, fears, plans, and anticipations in all shapes and forms. So we have to find our way back to the long now, as well as to the thick now, in order to find room for reflection, decision, and action. And this is, in my opinion, what Slavs and Tartars are contributing to with their lecture and performance. Reframing, reconfiguring, restaging the now. A very different now from the one we're used to from our daily lives. A now which isn't just a flicker or a glimpse, but which has extension and thickness, which has multiple layers underneath the ever-changing surface. Excuse me. So, to the idea of the now as a point corresponds another idea also inspired by Euclidean geometry of time as a line, a timeline as we're used to calling it, which is really an infinite succession of nows, of moments extending some billions of years into the past as well as endlessly into the future. When this empty, absolute and mathematical time, invented by Isaac Newton at the end of the 17th century, was taken up as a principle for organizing human events, actions and experiences, what we usually call history, it came to be named progress. Of course, there were other possible names, such as Bildung in German or Perfectibilité in French, but in essence, they were the same name for linear, homogeneous, progressive, teleological time about to take mankind from barbarism in different forms to civilization. Universal history, another word for the same kind of movement as was invented by German thinkers like Johann Gottfried Herder and Georg Friedrich Hegel, started in the Far Orient, where the infancy of mankind took place, set forth in the Near Orient, where mankind spent its childhood. Then it moved on to Egypt, where mankind entered its youth, etc. This life, which is at the same time ontogenetic and phylogenetic, individual and collective, culminates in Europe in the 19th century, if we are to believe Hegel. According to him, nations across the globe are never part of the same now. More precisely, non-Europeans are never in sync with their European counterparts. That is, they don't share the same time. They're not at the same level or stage of civilization, but are lagging hopelessly behind, unable to keep step or to catch up. They are at the same time, but not in the same time. They are what the Germans refer to as ungleichzeitig, out of sync, or in the words of the anthropologist Johannes Fabian, they are denied coevalness, which you might as well call nowness. This denial of coevalness applied to non-European cultures is also what the literary historian and critic Edward Said, a key figure as you've just seen in the lecture by Slavs and Tatars, attributes to those scholars, philologists, archaeologists, and historians who he famously labeled Orientalists. Not in the descriptive historical meaning, obviously, but this in a decidedly pejorative sense. In his 1978 bestseller, he shows how the linearity and teleology of Western historical time, of progress, was applied to the Near and the Middle East by Anglo-American Orientalists like Edward Lane and William Jones, to the effect that non-Europeans were seen either as delayed in their civilizing process, still like children, or living outside time altogether in a kind of pre-civilization paradise. In both cases, they were denied the opportunity to take part in history and decide and shape their own fate. In some cases, Said argued these scholars even furnished the colonialist authorities with the arguments and knowledge they needed to be successful in their domination of the colonized, as we just heard from Payam. So the question remains, does Said's vehement and often unfair attack on a tradition in Western scholarship contribute to reconfiguring how we think about historical time, and more precisely, how we think about the now? Slavs and Tatars seems to think that it doesn't. And indeed, at the closer inspection, Said's attack is itself as much a vehicle for the Western myth of linear theological time as the Orientalism he's attacking. The difference is only that inside history in the West no longer advances toward a pinnacle of civilization when liberty, democracy, and peace will reign supreme, but on the contrary, toward a pinnacle of imperialism, ethnocentrism, and racism. So there are narratives and counter-narratives. Orientalism, as theorized by Said, mounted a convincing and extremely successful counter-narrative to the Western myth of progress. Both narrative and counter-narrative, however, organize time in much the same way. Slavs and Tatars, by contrast, doesn't start with a narrative, but with an archive. That is an archive that is not yet an archive, but a mass of historical material of various kinds, books, texts, images, lives, events, places. And they set out to explore this material, investigate it, even excavate it, to ensure themselves that they are not reproducing narratives or counter-narratives from the quasi-mythological, naturalized complex of Orientalism. They give their subject a strong reflexive element. They studied the East in the East, the archives of Russian Orientalism. So when Gwen was speaking, I just understood that the difference between political scientists and historians, because you were sort of concerned about the lack of time in political science. I would be more concerned about the lack of space in history. So that is an interesting disciplinary difference, I think. But we're both concerned. That's a good thing. So, to move on, there's an old and often repeated quote that some claim goes back to the English 17th century philosopher John Locke, whereas others attributed to lesser-known thinkers and writers as Samuel Pocas or Isaac Vossius. This attribution is not our concern. The quote itself, however, is, and it goes as follows. History has two eyes. They are chronology and geography. And if history, mostly imagined as a woman, often identified as Clio, the Greek muse, is not able to use both of her eyes for some reason or another, she's as good as blind. So the Slavs and Tatars performance can be perceived as an attempt at curing a kind of blindness in the Western experience of history. At least since the end of the 18th century, history has been peering helplessly at the past with only one good eye. This good eye, of course, is chronology, which has enabled historians to create grand narratives about the rise of the Western world, the nation-state, democracy, and freedom. Every now and again, a historian has come around, like to discuss Said, who actually does have some sight left, albeit quite poor, in his other eye, the eye of geography, but not enough, it seems, to give his vision the necessary balance and depth. Of course, this is not quite true. Not anymore. Lately, not only history, but several disciplines and fields of knowledge in the humanities and social sciences have been exposed to what often is referred to as a spatial turn, or return of space, eine Wiederkehr des Raumes, as the great historian of Eastern Europe here in Berlin, Karl Schlögl, has famously called it. And it is interesting to note that also in the case of Slavs and Tatars, the deep knowledge of the Eurasian continent from Berlin to Beijing is what enables them to explore alternate histories, other narratives, which serves to counter both the linear narrative of Western civilization and the just as linear, though inverse narrative of Orientalism. By opening up new spaces, often completely unknown to Western historical imagination, they also open up new times. Who in this room, who's not a specialist in Russian history, could honestly claim any in-depth or even superficial knowledge of Tatarstan and its capital Kazan? I did that well, I think. Which in the 19th century became the powerhouse of Russian Orientalism. Who has really taken in the historical importance of the Great Steppe? The enormous open areas of grasslands and savannas connecting Europe, Central East and South Asia, as well as the Middle East, and the home of powerful nomadic tribes such as the Huns and the Mongols, and not least the site of what Slavs and Tatars aptly calls Russia's self-colonization or internal colonization. And last but not least, as we heard from Gwendolyn Sasse at the end, the Crimean Peninsula, which offered Russia both its first Orient and its main link to Greek and Western antiquity, and where both Greek ruins and plants of different geographic origins manifest another physical but also historical and temporal layer underneath the surface of political history. When all these new spaces, geographical, topographical, archaeological, ecological, are laid open, made accessible for our historical imagination, as expansions or even extensions of the now, something also happens to time. Distributed across space, time loses its singularity and its homogeneity, maybe even its linearity, at least its directionality. The Hegelian conjunction of time and space, that the goal of history lies in Western Europe, even in Germany, can no longer be upheld. Instead, we discover multiple parallel times unfolding in different geographical spaces. The time of the Russian Empire for which the rhythms are set by advances and setbacks of self-colonization, the time of the Great Steppe, whose movements follow the movements of the nomadic tribes, the time of the Crimean Peninsula, once the garden of the Russian Empire, where the natural history of plants create another historical and temporal layer different from, and maybe even deeper and slower than the layer of political events, which recently took such a dramatic turn. Opening up other geographical spaces, and this is going to be my last point, and thus exposing other temporal lines or layers is in itself not enough. If the goal is to expand and extend the now, in the sense of our common collective now, these multiple spaces and times also have to be brought into our present historical experience or imagination, be merged with our own ongoing struggles to historicize ourselves. In the performance by Slavs and Tartars, the exploration of alternate geographic spaces is inextricably linked to the exploration of another kind of space. As you've all seen, that's the space of the page, or the space of the book, or even the space of the slide. Their self-proclaimed obsession with books, which includes, I would presume, both books they come across and books they produce themselves, cannot, at least as I see it, be separated from their fascination with geographical space. Because the book, and by extension the page and the slide, can contain, hold, or accommodate the multiplicity of objects which originate from completely different historical contexts, much like a geographical landscape. In this way, the space of the book is able to reproduce the simultaneity of the non-simultaneous, die Gleichzeitigkeit des Ungleichzeitigen, which is contained in any geographical and topographical landscape, but which do not and cannot fit into the linear succession of the written or the spoken word, the narrative or the lecture. So most of the slides you've been watching are indeed manifestations of this, manifestations of the simultaneity of the non-simultaneous. When the simultaneity of the slide space, if you like, combines and brings together elements, text and images, which are completely non-simultaneous, in the sense that they come from completely different historical contexts, old or new, near or far, to the extent that, as you've just seen, Charlie Sheen becomes an illustration of the work of 19th century Russian Orientalists. Which is a surprising place to see Charlie Sheen, I think. In this way, by means of these slides, and of course the lecture that accompany them, new, different, and innovative combinations of elements and objects are brought into the now, into our now, extending and expanding it, not into a point or a line, but into a multi-layered time field in which the past lingers on and the future precedes itself, and we, the spectators, are turned into explorers, navigators, and even archaeologists of our own simultaneous, non-simultaneous, spatially distributed present. Thank you.